They thought I was just a quiet cabin owner, until they tried to steal what's mine. Hit like if you've ever dealt with power-hungry idiots in positions they don't deserve, and drop a comment with how you put them back in their place. I always liked to keep to myself. My lake cabin wasn't just some weekend getaway, it was my sanctuary. Tucked into the pines on a secluded lot by Silverstone Lake, it was where I unplugged from the corporate chaos, brewed questionable coffee, and listened to the birds cuss each other out like sailors. It had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built it with his own hands in the late 60s, back when land was dirt cheap and no one gave a damn about HOAs. That's right, there was no Homeowners Association when we bought the land. But times change. People move in, build their oversized cabins with Wi-Fi mesh networks and electric car chargers, and suddenly they think they own the forest. That's where Crescent Ridge HOA comes in. They were formed about 5 years ago when the lakeside population tripled and some tech bros from the city decided they wanted rules. Not suggestions, rules. You know, to maintain property values and preserve the natural aesthetic. Translation: no boats after 7 p.m., your fire pit needs a permit, and God forbid your porch light isn't solar-powered. I never joined, never signed anything. My lot is legally outside their jurisdiction, but that didn't stop them from trying. It started small. Passive-aggressive notes taped to my gate about non-compliant fencing and unauthorized modifications. They meant my weathered wooden dock, which predates their existence. Then came the citations, unsigned, of course, no letterhead, just printed sheets dropped in my mailbox. I ignored them. But apparently, ignoring narcissists triggers them. Because one Tuesday in mid-September, I got the letter. Certified mail, gold-embossed HOA logo like they were the Supreme Court of Lake Silverstone. Inside, dear property occupant. Occupant, not even my damn name. Off to a great start. Due to recent resolutions passed by the Crescent Ridge Homeowners Association Board, we regret to inform you that your occupancy of Lot 19B is deemed non-compliant with community bylaws and aesthetics. Buckle up. The HOA is initiating proceedings to assume stewardship of the property in accordance with the Preservation Clause. Excuse me? If not vacated within 30 days, legal steps will be taken to recover control of the parcel for community beneficial redevelopment and auction. Auction. They were going to evict me and sell my family's land, all because I refused to bow to a board full of bored housewives and semi-retired real estate consultants. At first, I laughed. Then I got quiet. I knew how these clowns worked. HOA boards like Crescent Ridge operate on ego and fear, tired or too broke to fight back. Unfortunately for them, I'm neither. There's something about being underestimated that's almost flattering. They assumed I was just some scruffy recluse with a beard, a kayak, and a Wi-Fi signal that cuts out when it rains. Which, to be fair, is not entirely wrong. But they didn't know the rest. See, I may enjoy chopping firewood and drinking instant coffee like a mountain hobo, but from Monday to Friday, I run compliance audits for a private equity firm, which means my job quite literally is to dismantle red tape and find the legal weak points in bloated bureaucracies. HOAs are my bread and butter. So after pouring myself a whiskey and framing their little letter like a kindergarten art project, I started digging. First stop, the county clerk's office. They didn't expect me to check land use records, zoning maps, or property easement laws, but I did, and guess what? Lot 19B was never included in any annexation proposal filed by the HOA. The boundary lines stop a full 150 feet short of my property. Not that facts ever stop power-tripping committees. Even better, my grandfather had filed an exemption clause back in 1972 when the lake first got subdivided. A dusty old piece of paper stating that our cabin could never be reassigned or rezoned without direct family consent. So legally, I was untouchable. But this wasn't about legality anymore. It was about nerve. I could have stopped there, sent them a cease and desist, hired a lawyer, but something in me snapped, not out of rage, but curiosity. I wanted to see how far they were willing to go. So I played dumb. I replied to their letter with a beautifully vague response. Thank you for your recent notice. I'm happy to cooperate where reasonable. Please send me the full HOA charter, voting record on this decision, and minutes from any board meetings where Lot 19B was discussed. That email must have landed like a brick in their inbox. Because 3 days later, I got a call. Mr. Tanner, this is Susan Penfield from the Crescent Ridge HOA. Ah, Susan, president of the board, drives a Range Rover, leads yoga retreats, has 2 sons named Tanner and Beckett. She tried to keep her voice warm, but you could hear the ice underneath. I just wanted to clarify some of the misunderstandings. You see, the HOA recently voted to consolidate certain orphan lots into our governance structure. I let her talk. She used phrases like community wellness, environmental stewardship, and shared prosperity. Then I dropped my first little bomb. That's interesting, Susan. Just wondering, did you disclose your personal interest in Lot 19B during the vote? Silence. See, public records showed that Susan's husband, Ken Penfield, had tried to buy my cabin last year, and I refused. Apparently, they'd wanted to turn it into a lakeside Airbnb, but I declined, politely. So this wasn't about stewardship, it was about— Because if you didn't disclose that, I'd say the board has a potential conflict of interest, which, in an HOA framework, could invalidate any vote involving you. She stuttered something about needing to consult legal counsel, then hung up. And just like that, I had them rattled. But I wasn't done. I started printing flyers. Real ones, full color, glossy paper, the kind of thing you'd see for lost cats or bake sales. Only mine said, "Your HOA is lying to you. How Crescent Ridge tried to illegally seize a private cabin." And I delivered one to every mailbox in the community. Anonymous, of course, but everyone knew who sent them. And that's when the gloves came off. The HOA board wasn't used to pushback, especially not the kind that came dressed in legalese, veiled threats, and perfectly timed community flyers. By the end of the week, their email list was on fire. I heard from my neighbor Rick, a retired Marine with zero patience for HOA nonsense, that an emergency board meeting had been called. Closed to non-members, of course, but word travels fast in a neighborhood full of restless retirees with binoculars and golf carts. Apparently, my flyer had unnerved them. Residents were asking questions about the board's decision-making process, about Susan's interest in my lot, about why they were even targeting an exempt property in the first place. And the best part? They still thought I was bluffing. They underestimated just how far I was willing to go to protect what's mine. I launched phase 2 of my little campaign. I started by filing a Freedom of Information Act request with the local planning commission. Anytime the HOA communicates with a government body, it's technically public record, especially when it involves zoning. And wouldn't you know it, 3 emails popped up between Susan and a council member named Greg, discussing the long-term community benefit of acquiring Lot 19B for commercial use. Commercial, not preservation, not environmental stewardship. No, this was about money. Next, I called in a favor from a friend who works in real estate development. He posed as a potential buyer and reached out to the HOA with interest in any upcoming auction properties, particularly lakefront. They sent him a brochure. My cabin was listed, with a mock-up render of a multi-unit luxury retreat on the spot where my grandfather's dock still stood. They hadn't just jumped the gun. They'd loaded the rifle, pulled the trigger, and were now pretending the bullet hadn't left the chamber. So I made my move. Saturday morning, I hosted what I called the Coffee and Constitution meetup at my cabin. I invited about 20 neighbors, people who'd lived here longer than the HOA had even existed. People who liked fishing more than fine print, but hated being lied to. I stood on my porch, held up the HOA's seizure letter, and calmly explained what was really going on. I didn't shout, I didn't curse, I didn't need to. Because halfway through my speech, I handed out copies of the emails, the zoning maps, and my grandfather's exemption clause. Susan had tried to frame this as some noble cause, but I had documents, and people love documents when they smell blood. Rick, the Marine, leaned over and muttered, "Hell, if they tried that on my property, I'd burn their little HOA shack to the ground." Legally, he was joking, probably. By the end of the day, I had signatures from half the community requesting a vote to audit the HOA board and an email thread going with a local reporter who was very interested in a story about HOA corruption, hidden deals, and abuse of power in a lakeside neighborhood. It was all very polite on the surface, but underneath, it was nuclear, and I still hadn't shown my full hand. 2 days after my coffee and Constitution gathering, the HOA struck back, poorly. They sent me a final eviction notice, taped to my fence post in a plastic sleeve, like it was some kind of sacred decree. This one had all the bells and whistles, bold fonts, fake legal jargon, and get this, a deadline in red ink. Honestly, it looked like it had been written by someone who watched one too many courtroom dramas and thought cease and desist meant do whatever you want. But here's the fun part. They CC'd the county, and the county clerk's office immediately forwarded it to their legal team, who forwarded it to me with a note that basically read, "Is this some kind of joke?" See, what the HOA didn't realize is that by trying to evict me from non-HOA land, and by pretending to have governmental authority, they'd stepped into civil fraud territory. I now had enough documentation to file a lawsuit. But that's not how I wanted this to end. No, I wanted a spectacle. So I did what any rational man with a penchant for surgical revenge would do. I hosted a barbecue. I planned it for the same weekend as the HOA's monthly meeting, which, conveniently, was held at the community pavilion just a few lots down from my cabin. I rented tents, hired a local band, set up coolers, grills, and made a big, bold sign at the entrance. Save the cabin. HOA tried to steal it. Let's talk about it. People came in droves. There was pulled pork, cold beer, and one very large poster board with every shady document the HOA had tried to slip past the community. But the highlight? I'd rented a projector. As the sun set and the HOA's meeting was in full swing, I turned my cabin's exterior wall into a giant screen and projected the email from Susan's husband trying to bribe the council member to fast-track the zoning change for Lot 19B. Yep, that one. People gasped. Phones came out. Cameras flashed. You could hear the HOA's meeting unraveling in real time. Someone shouted, "What the hell is this?" followed by a chair being scraped aggressively across concrete. I sipped my beer and toasted the screen. By the end of the night, 4 board members had resigned. Susan tried to save face the next morning. She came to my cabin, still in her yoga clothes, armed with an obviously rehearsed apology. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said. I let her talk, for a full 2 minutes, then handed her a manila envelope. Inside, a formal complaint filed with the County Ethics Board, and a petition to dissolve the HOA, already gaining serious traction. "You tried to steal from the wrong person, Susan," I said. "This isn't just about a cabin. It's about people like you thinking you're untouchable." She left without another word. But that wasn't the final blow. That came a week later, when my friend at the local paper published an exposé titled "Power, Profit, and Pine. Trees. How one HOA tried to seize private land and got burned." The community went ballistic. The article hit like a thunderclap. It didn't just tell my story, it named names. It laid out every detail: the zoning manipulation, the internal conflicts of interest, the harassment tactics, even the staged auction listing for my property. There was no spin left for the HOA board to put on it. The mask had dropped, and what people saw underneath? Ugly. I heard Susan tried to call the reporter and claim defamation. The reporter responded by publishing the audio of their call. After that, no one returned her emails. The backlash was immediate. First, the HOA's legal counsel resigned, quietly, professionally, but definitely because they saw the storm coming. Then residents demanded a general board vote, something they hadn't had in over 2 years, despite it being required in the HOA's own bylaws. Ironic, right? With pressure mounting, the county stepped in. They launched a formal investigation into the HOA's practices, especially surrounding their finances and zoning collusion. That's when it got fun. Turns out the HOA had used community funds, dues paid by residents, to hire consultants for a redevelopment proposal. The same proposal that included tearing down my cabin and replacing it with rental units. Worse, they tried to do it without a community vote. You can imagine how well that went over. The next board meeting was a circus. People showed up with pitchforks, figuratively and in one case, literally. Thanks, Rick. Susan and the remaining board members tried to explain it all away, claimed it was for the greater good, that I was spreading misinformation, that the media twisted the facts. But no one was buying it anymore. When the vote was held, it wasn't even close. 98% voted to dissolve the current board. And then came the motion to disband the HOA entirely. I didn't even have to say a word. The community buried the very institution that tried to steal my land. And I just sat there, arms crossed, watching the whole thing fall apart like a cheap card table. Within a month, the HOA was officially disbanded. My land was reaffirmed by the county as untouchable, with a permanent record update. Susan? Her name is now tied to a fraud scandal that made local headlines and completely torpedoed her husband's real estate business. They sold their house within 60 days and moved out, quietly. No goodbye party. And the community? Happier, freer, a little more neighborly. As for me, I rebuilt the dock, stained it dark walnut this time. I even installed solar lights, just to piss off Susan's ghost, wherever she haunts now. Every now and then, someone stops by and asks how I did it, how I took down an entire HOA with a few pieces of paper and a barbecue. I just smile and say, they thought I was just some guy with a cabin. Turns out I was the wrong guy to mess with. And then I go back to enjoying the peace they tried to take away.